So today I want to walk you through your soldering technical. You're going to be making a ring, and this is a sample to show you kind of what I'm looking for. This project is cool because it has every joint that you need to learn on it. So the attachment from the C to the circle is a sweat joint. The attachment that's holding the band together is a butt joint, and the joint that attaches the band to the circle is a T-joint. For the record, this is probably C quality. Notice that the solder seam of the sweat joint does not go all around the joint. And notice all the excess solder on the band. Okay, so before I teach you how to form a ring band, the metal I'm going to use is a little hard, so I'm going to anneal it. So annealing is basically just heating up the metal to make it soft. Copper doesn't take much and also can take more heat than silver. Brass is harder than copper and can take about as much heat as copper, if not more. So I'm just kind of touching it to warm it up so that when I go to form it, it bends easier. So this is a ring mandrel. The ones at school are probably a lot cleaner than this one. And I know you won't be able to see from your angle, but the sizes of the rings go all along the cylinder. You can check what size you are using one of these, which we have in our supply closet, and then I recommend putting that on one of these ring mandrels to make sure that they're the same size. So there is a formula to ensure that you're getting the right size for the right size ring for the size of wire you are using. I don't use it because math is not my friend. So basically what I do is I wrap it around the ring mandrel at the size that I want it. So because my metal is nice and soft, it wraps right around. Gonna give it a little whack with my rawhide mallet to ensure that it's round. And I'm gonna snip it right there. You can use your saw blade, will give you a better edge, but for the sake of the demo, just moving right along. So in this case, you can go and hammer down the edges, and this will also give you an idea if you need to remove more material to make it the size you want. And then we're going to look at the edges and line them up. If your metal is flat, so you can do the same process with sheet metal, you can do it with round wire, you can do it with square wire. This just so happens to be half square and half round. So I'm going to line up the edges and see how they meet. If there's remember, solder isn't spackle, so if there's a gap, you're going to need to file them. Probably would prefer using my needle file, but this will be fine. It's perfectly acceptable to change the shape of the band. It doesn't have to be round to solder it. I find that I never solder them completely round. I rather have a flat plane like this. So if you look close, this is a pretty tight seam. Both edges are filed flush, and this will make a great solder seam. So now I'm going to pickle this and solder it, and it will be my butt joint of this sample. Okay, so I'm ready to solder my joint. I have some clean hard solder that I am cutting up and placing on the brick. You want your solder to be clean. You can either pickle it or run some sandpaper over it. I put some flux on my joint and notice my third hand. Third hands are great to keep what you're working on steady, but it also is a heat suck. So it's going to take more heat to get my piece hot because the steel is going to want to grab it all. So the way you kind of start is putting your solder onto your piece before heating it up. As you practice, you might find that you like putting the solder on after with the torch in hand. Oh, you're not supposed to see that.
You didn't?
We don't use lighters at school. They are not allowed. All right, so I'm going to start heating up my joint. You want to heat up the whole piece, especially when you're working with something like silver, copper, or brass, so that, oops, that flew way before I wanted it to, but that's okay. So I'm going to bring the heat back over here. Come on. What a brat. All right, there we go. So now I'm going to throw this in the pickle and work on my next part of the ring. Okay, so now I'm working on the top of the ring, which is a sweat joint. It's going to be 2 pieces of metal, and this is going to be the top part. So what I'm going to do is heat it up. You can already have your solder on this. Old habits die hard, and I like to attach my solder with the torch in hand. So I'm gonna hit like all the main corners. Probably doesn't need that much, but as you saw with my first sample, it didn't have enough to go around. So I'm going to heat it up just enough for the solder to flow. Did you see that? That was super cool. So now that's fine, and I'm going to throw this in the pickle and let it clean, and then I will fuse it to the piece that it's going on top of. And that's your starting your sweat solder joint. All right, so now both of my pieces of metal are clean. I'm going to flux the sides that are connecting. As you can see, I have my melted solder on this piece. So when you're making yours, I really don't care what kind of design you do. All I care is that you're showing me that you can melt solder on one piece and then have it fuse to a piece below. So I did this kind of like weird marquee kite shape thing. All right, so it's not lying flush because the solder has built up on the one side and it will go flush as soon as it melts. And that will be a good indicator that it worked. All right. So I'm gonna heat up the whole surface. When you're soldering 2 pieces together, you wanna try to heat both equally. And if one is larger than the other, the larger piece is gonna need more attention with the heat. With copper or brass, you'll be able to see the solder seam a lot quicker and a lot easier. I have a pretty trained eye, so I can see that my solder went all the way around. But I'm gonna do it just a little bit more just to be sure. And then this goes in the pickle. Okay, now that our top piece is pickling, we can start shaping our ring band. No matter how round it was before you soldered it, it probably needs some refinement. So we're going to put it on the ring mandrel, and we're going to take a rawhide mallet or a plastic mallet. I do not recommend a steel one because it will add a texture and make your ring bigger. Alright, so you want to hit it equally all around the ring. Notice that the ring is bigger on the bottom than on the top. So you're going to want to flip your ring around so that the opening doesn't have like a cone shape like the mandrel. Pretty round. Okay, since I'm using half round wire, I want to give it a little flat spot to ensure that the joint has a really nice connection. I'm not saying that if you're using round wire that it won't solder to a flat surface. I just feel that a flat surface to a flat surface creates a stronger joint. So the way I do that is I just put it, try to go as straight as possible and give it a little flat surface. Another way you can do it is by holding your file flat and then nice and slow so that you don't take too much material off and that you don't go beyond the little flat spot you need, because if you move it too much while you're doing it, you're going to get more flat spots and it's going to look kind of weird on your round wire. So that's why I'm going nice and slow. Now I have a nice little shelf, and it's going to make my soldering process so much easier because it's not going to want to roll around on the flat piece. Alright, so now that both my band and my top piece are clean, I'm going to apply some flux to where the joint's going to meet. You want to avoid touching your solder seams because your fingers are oily and solder does not like oil. I've already cut up some medium solder. My two previous joints were done with hard. This way, while I'm melting the medium, my hard solder joints won't melt because the medium will float at a lower temperature. So at this point, you would probably have already placed your solder. I prefer to place my solder after I've dried up some of the flux. So as you can see, we have a lot more mass on the ring band because it's bigger, but also because we have the third arm sucking up a lot of heat. So where I would normally try to keep the heat super equal, I'm focusing more on the ring band because I know that needs more heat than the top piece. Okay, so now I'm going to place my solder, but you probably have already done that. Alright, so I did it on both sides. Sometimes I would only do it on one and then really focus the heat on the opposite side. The solder goes where the heat is. So if I want to bring the solder from here through and under, I would focus the heat here. But for demo purposes, I have it on both sides, so I can just try to heat up everything. Since I took the heat off when I was placing the solder, I need to go back on the ring band and add a lot more heat because I lost a lot. Oh, one of them flew. How'd this one? Looks good. As my Metal Ones teacher would say, that's a Disney on Ice seam. Now I'm going to throw it in the pickle.
Action.
Okay, so after your ring is all soldered, you're going to want to do some cleanup. All you're looking for in a solder joint is just a little silver line of where the joint is. So as I said before, this is way too much solder and should be sanded. You can take a file to it to make things go quicker, but that will probably change the shape of your metal. So I recommend going in with some 220. For this project, I'm just looking for a nice, even, sanded finish so that I can seal your joints and focus on that. At some point, I will show you how to do some polishing with the flex shaft, but at this moment, I'm really interested in seeing your solder skill.